Folks, have you ever found yourself in a season of life that was just plain hard? I mean, a season where you felt like you were in a desert. I want to show you how. When you find yourself in the midst of one of those seasons, you are actually never alone. Now, you may be familiar with the story of the Old Testament. There, God uses Moses, you might remember Moses, to free God's people from slavery in Egypt. For generations and generations, God's people, they had been forced to be slaves under the evil Pharaoh. But finally, after generations, God has freed them from this horrible life. And every time I read that story, I've always found it interesting that God, did you notice this? He doesn't immediately free them. God actually frees them from Egypt, but leads them out into an unexpected place. God leads them to the desert. In fact, it's there that they wander for 40 years. You might wonder, as I did, why would God do this? Well, let me share a little Hebrew lesson with you. Are you ready? Get this. The Hebrew word for desert is a word midbar in Hebrew. You say midbar. Good. Get this. Midbar, the word for desert, is spelled the exact same way in Hebrew as the word for speak. Now, this is not a coincidence. For the authors of the Bible, the desert was the place where God spoke to people again and again. It's where God spoke to Abraham. It's where God spoke to Moses and David and John the Baptist. It's even where the Holy Spirit sent Jesus before his public ministry. Why did they all find themselves in the desert? Because it's in the desert. That's the place that God speaks to God's people. Now, when we talk about a desert season, we usually think about a time when nothing's going right. Am I right? Your marriage is on the rocks. There's just no spark. You're busy with work and the kids, and nothing seems to be going right. Finances aren't what you hope to be. We call those seasons desert seasons. Desert has a kind of negative connotation, but in the Bible, the desert is the place where God speaks to God's people. Before his public ministry, the Holy Spirit sent Jesus out into the desert. Why? It wasn't to punish him. Jesus went to the wilderness to hear from God. Moses, Abraham, for both of them, the desert was a place where they heard from God. Now, isn't that interesting? You and I, we try to avoid the desert seasons in our life. We think God is distant from us in those seasons. But the authors of the Bible suggest that the desert is the place where we actually hear from God. A friend of mine reminded me the other day that instead of asking God, when can I get out of my desert season? Maybe we should ask, what can I get out of my desert season? I don't know about you, but what I've found is that when I've gone through a desert season, one of those hard seasons, often I'm able to look back and see that God was closer than I could ever imagine. When I walked through a divorce, when I've walked through the worst of family situations, through deaths and losses in my life, on the far side of those desert seasons, you know what I realized? I realized that God was closer in the desert than I could ever imagine. Folks, God chose the desert because we all face things that are hard and feel as though our lives are all dried up, as though we're wandering in the desert all alone. Gang, no matter how isolated you feel today, would you know this? Would you hear this? God is closer to you in the desert than anywhere else.